Today on the Crit House Masters, we discuss the work of Lewis Baltz. Lewis Baltz, an American photographer, was a master of capturing the essence of man-made structures and landscapes in stark black and white images. In the early 1970s, his austere and monochrome pictures of suburban development helped redefine American landscape photography. Baltz was a part of a group of photographers known as the New Topographics, sharing an aesthetic that drew on contemporary art and rejected the romanticism of traditional landscape photography. The group focused on the impact of urbanization and the homogenization of America. In 1975, the New Topographics held an influential exhibition at the George Eastman House in Rochester, New York, showcasing their photography of a man-altered landscape. Baltz's photographs of industrial sites, office parks, and suburban developments were often shot formally, emphasizing geometry and repetition. Interestingly, Baltz never saw himself as a photographer, nor did he feel any allegiance to its history. He simply made photographs as the most direct way to record something. Baltz's work has been exhibited at major museums and galleries worldwide, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York City and the Art Institute of Chicago. He received numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and a National Endowment for the Arts grant. And despite his passing in Paris in 2014, Baltz's legacy continues to influence and inspire photographers today. He leaves behind a remarkable body of work that captures the essence of the man-made world around us. So yes, today we talk about Lewis Baltz on the Crit House, and we welcome you all here today with what we're calling Crit House Masters. And I'm very honored that we have two amazing photographers to join us here to have this conversation. Neal Rantoul is an artist and an educator. He was the head of the photo program at Northeastern University for 30 years. He also taught at Harvard University, and he now focuses on making new work and bringing earlier work to a national and international audience. And I believe he may be working on a book as well, so hopefully that will come through. And also with us is Michael Hintlian. He is also a photographer. He is educated at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. His work has appeared in publications internationally, and he is widely exhibited and collected as well. His book is Digging: The Workers of Boston's Big Dig. He has taught at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, the New England School of Photography, the New School for Social Research, and the Parsons School of Design. And I really want to thank you both for joining us here on the Crit House. This will be, for me, a fascinating conversation, because I have to say, I did not know an awful lot about Lewis Baltz until it was suggested, and I started doing some research. So Neal and Michael, maybe we can start off talking a little bit about the New Topographics photographers and not only photographers, but the show as well, because since 1975, when the show came out, it has had an amazing, huge influence on photography for the next 50 years. Why is that? What is it about this body of work that made it so influential and such a huge thing in the photographic history? Neal?
Want me to go? I can see.
You go, or either one.
I have the book.
Yep.
I saw the show at Eastman House a long time ago, and you at that time you didn't see photographs like these. These were just not part of the global conversation of photography. So this was something that I think had been looked at by photographers, photographing the man-made landscape, and working with those ideas, and just seeing what was here to photograph them, and to have them stand on their own as pictures. I think that was the breakthrough, and this was put together by, was it William Jenkins? Is that the guy's name?
Yes.
William Jenkins. And what he did was gather photographers, and it's in terms of the global conversation, it's the A list of photographers.
I've got Michael, I've got that list of those people. Should I just read them off?
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Sure.
Robert Adams, Lewis Baltz, Hillard and Vern Becker, if I'm saying that right, Joe Deal, Frank Golke, Nicholas Nixon, John Scott, and Stephen Shore.
And Henry Wessel.
And Henry Wessel, exactly.
You can just stop the picture right there.
Yeah, it's a big one. That picture changed my life, my photographic life.
It's an incredible photograph.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It's funny that you say this because I had been looking at these images, and I had been looking at all of them since we started talking about this. But now that you say that, and it's on the screen in front of me, it is an amazing image.
So I don't mean to interrupt you, Michael, but I just wanted to say one thing, and that is that in this coming to be seen, this work coming to be seen in that year, 75 or 76 maybe, I think what it did is it gave us permission to look this way. There's a long-standing tradition of the Ansel Adamses, Ed Westons, and the landscape people, and it kind of revolutionized the way that people could look at the world and react to what was happening in Lou Baltz's case in California with it. Urban sprawl and with things expanding out into a landscape that for the first time. So of the work in that show, clearly Lewis Baltz is one of the major players, I think.
Yes.
And here we are talking about him and his work. Michael and I had this discussion earlier. We posed the idea that is this guy a one-shot wonder? And clearly there's other work, and he carried on after this body work was finished. He died in 2014 in Europe. But was this one shot, or was he continuing to be strong? And for me, there's such fundamentally powerful pictures, and so understated and so cleanly presented that you can't escape their power. And they weren't particularly large photographs, if I remember correctly, and they were this very cold tonality and contrast, fairly high contrast. And then I learned from Michael just a couple of weeks ago that these were some sort of high-end 35 millimeter panchromatic fine grain approach. I always thought they were view camera, but they look view camera.
All right. So you just said a series of words about what it was that I don't know. What does that mean?
There's a whole sort of school of characters that were trying to make the best possible quality out of 35 millimeter with low ASA film and a special developer for fine grain. And if it was done right, it could be quite convincing that it was made with a much larger camera.
Okay, so yes. I'm sorry to ask the question. So it was finely grained, but how? And on the wall, Michael, since you saw it, how large were these?
They weren't big. They were. I mean, I think the biggest of them might have been 11 by 14.
Right.
Paper size, but with like an 8 by 12 inch image. The thing that drew me into Lewis Baltz. And, I looked at the pictures and to me, they were just undecipherable. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I mean, I was young, but now I'm older and I'm still puzzled by his pictures. So I dug in from another angle. I was looking at I really studied his technique as much as I could to know what I was looking at and why the images had this particular quality to them. This uber sharp, crisp, contrasty look to it. And I was obsessed by it. So I found out that he was using Panatomic X film, a 32 ASA film with Rodinal developer. And there were formulas out there about how to use the developer in that film. But the technology came out of is stamp collecting numismatics? Is that it?
Mm-hmm.
I think it is.
Yep.
Stamp collectors were also big photographers in that they were using this high resolution film in a small camera to simply record their collections. And so this evolved out of stamp collecting, believe it or not. And, photographers took it on, quickly. And so Lewis Baltz, was using a Leica and a 50 millimeter lens on a tripod, using, small diaphragm openings on the lens and slower shutter speeds, and getting this amazing quality. Neil, when I saw the pictures the first time, I could have sworn that they were 4x5.
Yeah, me too.
They just had that
Sure
richness to it, and blew my mind when I found out he was like running around with a 35 millimeter camera on a tripod.
Jeff, can you hold this one for a second?
Yes, I can. Sure.
So this one and the one before, which both had a little bit of sky in them, were pictures that influenced me and got me into a frame of mind of thinking of the background of the picture of the sky in my horizon-based picture as being rendered as a flat surface as opposed to spatial. So here, this tonality of it being this light gray is very much the tonality of the building itself, very close. And so it flattens the picture and makes it more abstract. It's difficult to think that in my mind, to think that it would look like that if I were standing in front of that building. And I certainly wouldn't occur to define the space in this way before he made those pictures. It got me into a range of thinking about how I was trying to make my sky the same tonality and the same reflectivity as the surface of the building I was shooting. So what would happen in black and white with the distinguishing characteristic between the concrete or the surface of the building and the sky itself disappear, right? So just to give you, I'm trying to paint a picture of the influence these pictures had on me personally as a young guy in my career.
There was a point I was going to make about the picture that I asked you to stop at earlier. I heard Catherine Opie talk about this particular picture, and she was talking. Catherine Opie is an educator and a photographer in California who has done some really marvelous work, really a heavyweight nationally, internationally. And she was talking about how people look at Lewis Baltz's pictures and think, well, what's the big deal? There's not much going on. But if you start to look at them, you begin to see his repetition of shapes, these mounds that he's got in the pictures, these mounds of gravel, the mounds on the roofs of this building, and he's playing constantly with with shapes and angles and trying to repeat things in the same frame. Very, very, they're smart pictures. They're really smart. So that was the point I was going to make. So if you, as we begin to look through them, you'll begin to see the mounds and, you know, this kind of motif that that Baltz had in this mid-70s work.
So I guess that just to follow up on that, when I first saw this work, and even when I first saw Robert Adams' work when I was starting off, and I'm not educated and trained as a photographer. I'm just a guy who picks up a camera and I'm really interested in these things. But when I saw the new Topographics photographers, I was like, what is this? You know, this is boring. This is banal. This is banal. You know, and it wasn't, I mean, I don't think that now. I mean, I recognize what you're saying now, but there's visually, it's not, it doesn't have sort of the dynamism that a lot of people look for in photography, you know, the tensions that people look for. And certainly there are no people, but yet it has had this historical influence on certainly the two of you and Catherine Opie and all of the other photographers who have learned and grown and become photographers in their own right, learning from what they've done. But why is it? Why is it these banal images are still affecting?
Because they've moved photography on. These pictures have like as I said before, given permission to look in other areas, to look in different ways. And photography in its relatively short history has had periods where it's been moved on. The advent of the 35 millimeter camera was huge. The turning from a crucial importance of history in black and white to allowing color and working with color. Those are big and seminal changes. And this is one of them as well. And Bill Jenkins' brilliance was to find it and find it in a variety of different people. I mean, the Becker work is revolutionary as well. And so this was a clear time of change and moving things forward, and in some ways, leaving behind some of those traditions, saying that photography, it's a newer world. Look what's happening in California. Look, I mean, look at this. There's nothing of interest here. It's remarkable, right? So to put that up into a show and give it a kind of weight was a big change. And it took a while. Jeff and I were talking, Michael, just before we started, that this was a quiet revolution. It didn't really hit everybody like a lightning strike at one time. It took several years for this to kind of fit into the conversations and the collective understanding of the American photographic movement in those years. It wasn't really until 77 or 78, perhaps, that it became more widely known.
Well, Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt, Neal, but so Michael, you saw it in 75 at the Eastman House. Did it hit you like a ton of bricks? I mean, did it change you immediately, or was that something that came slower for you?
Well, I want to put things in context. You know, Neal's right. I mean, this work presented permission to a lot of us. At that time, there was a great deal of interest in social photography that was about the time. It was a reflection of the time. So you saw a lot of photographers making pictures of protest and so on. And it was I mean, this was actually well after D.N. Arbus, who passed away much earlier. But people were beginning to become conscious about how photography could be used in other ways. So you have that going on, and then you have this effort by this terrific curator to put together a body of work that addressed the landscape, but put it in context that that was germane to the time. You know, it fit. And I think it did take time for it to catch on and for it to be understood. And of course, there was no internet then, and there was no, instantaneous analysis that we kind of have today, which is, in some cases it serves certain things, and in other cases it doesn't. But I think that the reason this didn't really catch on as quickly is because it really wasn't disseminated. If you wanted to see the new Topographics show, you either, bought the catalog from Eastman House, and which is like the worst printing, and enjoyed it, or you made an effort to find the show. And I don't think it traveled all that much, Neil, did it?
No, it went to, yeah, I did. I found that it did get somewhere. It got out west at some point, but much later.
So I think it's important to talk about, to place all of this in the time. And, people did look at him, and I looked at Robert Adams' work for the first time. I had no idea who this guy was. I mean, and it puzzled me because the pictures looked very ordinary, very ordinary. Right. And I now know that they're not ordinary at all. And
so also with I mean, you and I went up to see that big Adams show up in Maine that time, Michael, and Adams' work without all of his text and his writing and his justification is almost meaningless. It's a package. The thinking and the writing about it becomes integral to the work itself.
That show,
right,
was a statement.
Yeah,
and it filled how many galleries at that museum?
Huge. That's right. Up at Bates College?
Bates College.
Yep.
And they have this like amazing gallery space, many gallery spaces. Yep. And the whole thing was filled with
Adams. Yep. Exactly.
With Adams' work. And it was all clear-cut forests and so on. It was just an amazing show.
Yep.
And
painful. Yep.
Yeah, you came out and you were exhausted. I mean, we had to have fried clams.
Right. That's right.
Oh, and that helped?
Yeah, it restored us. It was restorative. But anyway, I think it's important to place this in the time that it was made.
Yeah, I have an addition to that, and that is that, and we, Lou Jones and I talked about this in regards to Vivian Maier, and that was that photography was a smaller movement. It wasn't so diffuse and wide as it is now. It was a smaller group, particularly American, where it was accessible and more like a community of people working in their own spheres, but in relationship to each other. Not quite a community, but it definitely was a smaller thing in the mid-70s. You could make a cold call to somebody who was a famous person and see them and reach them and so on. It was possible to show your work to a major museum curator, and you can't do that anymore. You can't make an appointment to see a curator anymore. So it was different that way.
Oh, totally different. You know, I lived in New York for half a dozen years, and you know, in the late 70s, you could go to an opening and you could actually shake hands with Andre Cortez or Versailles, and I mean they would be there. I mean, these, you know,
Right.
Versailles, are you shitting me?
Yeah.
Unbelievable. And but that was it was a much smaller world.
You know, it's really been a pleasure sort of just listening to you guys discuss the things that you've been talking about while having these up on screen, because it gives you the opportunity to dive into the images in a way that sometimes you don't get these days when you're just flipping through on Instagram, or even with books when you're you know, sticking with them for a few seconds at a time, I think is fascinating. So maybe we could talk a little bit about Lewis Baltz specifically, and like where he sits. So we've been talking broadly about new topographics, and I mean to some extent about Lewis as well. But like, what is it? He did not consider himself to be a photographer, right? I mean,
No, he wasn't. That's true. He wasn't part of that whole kind of community of people. That's right. And actually left the country. I mean, ended up spending much of his later years in Europe.
I believe he died in Paris in 2014.
Hmm.
But what does that mean to not consider yourself to be a photographer and yet be considered, you know, of one of the greats? I mean, certainly he's out there in the world of photography and the pantheon of people who were talking about him because of the importance of his work, but doesn't consider himself to be a photographer. What does that mean?
Well, I want to address that, but you know, for me, it's a little intimidating to talk about, you know, this guy who's so obviously a giant in the medium that I love. So there's that, but I question if it was a statement that he made that he didn't consider himself a photographer. I question that because his attention to craft and, you know, having the right tools was every bit a photographer's concern, every bit. So, I mean, he was looking for something very specific and got something very specific in the look of his pictures. That says to me that, you know, he had a pretty serious commitment to being a photographer. I mean,
Right. Well, maybe
I'm
that's
missing
a role.
something, but
Maybe that's a role he took on in some ways, a characteristic that would put him outside of the mainstream, so that he would arrive at some sort of a stature. I don't really know.
you understand what I mean, though, Neil?
Yeah,
I mean,
I do. Yeah.
I mean, he on one hand, he's saying, "Oh, I'm not a photographer. I don't take this stuff seriously." Are you kidding me? I mean,
Right. It's very rigorous.
The guy's craft is like out of this world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, so I took it as being that he considers himself to be an artist, and that that as a painter considers him, you know, uses a brush, that he uses a camera. That's the way I heard it. And I don't know whether that's
that could be the case. That could be the case.
It also could be a statement of his belief in his own superiority. We don't really know, you know.
I will say that here's the mounds again. You know, look, see these repeats?
Yeah.
The mounds, and then the peaks of the roofs of the houses.
Yeah.
I mean, he's got this game going on. Really.
So this particular image, I believe, is a later image, and there's another. There are a lot of Robert Adams images that are similar to this. I saw a lot of influence of Robert Adams in this particular shot.
Well, and Henry Wessel has a whole series of night pictures too that are really interesting.
Well, maybe that provides some reinforcement for these people, doesn't it? where I'm not working in isolation. I'm not way out in left field. There are other people that are seeing the world in similar ways to that I am, in effect. And that could be sort of quite powerful and validating.
That's an interesting point, Neil, because I think at that time, the way photographers would dialogue with each other would be through bodies of work.
Exactly.
Right. They would share bodies. There's that peak again.
Yep.
See.
Well, so I mean, I think that's very much, and again, coming from a person who's not educated either in photography or in the art world, but from my understanding, is that there is a lot of dialogue in the art world. Painters are referencing other painters.
Yeah.
Is that what you're seeing here? I mean, so I actually have a question for you, Neil, because I went to your open studio some time ago before I started looking at the work here.
Mm-hmm.
I see some influence, and I don't know whether it's a direct influence or not, or maybe I'm just seeing it myself in some of the work that you have done in the work of Lewis Baltz and the new Topographics.
Some of the territory that he's explored is, I don't know that it's the mainstream of my work, but it's definitely an important part of the way I see. By 1981, I made a set of pictures of the JC Distribution Center and Warehouse outside of Hartford, Connecticut, that were not so dissimilar than these. Big series that you looked at, Jeff, called Mallchitecture.
Yes.
Just looking at malls, both abandoned and also active, through the viewpoint of surface and some of those blending ideas I talked about sky versus surface and abstraction and so on. So yeah, I mean, I'm in a project right now in Lunenburg, Mass. That is a warehouse that isn't so dissimilar to these. So I think I said this earlier, but I feel like this work allowed people like me to move on, to point a camera in this kind of direction and not be laughed out of the stadium, because before this, imagine taking work like this to some Stieglitz or some senior curator and Steichen and so on, and being thrown out, or even Zarkowski maybe, in the earlier days. So yeah, I think this has been very important work to me in the way that I see.
Michael, do you have the same? Has this work, either of Baltz or the new Topographics, has it influenced you? Because you do a different form of photography than I think Neil practices to some extent. Has this been an influence on you, and how so?
I think about it. I think about the other players in the new Topographics landscape. I look at their work a lot. Henry Wessel's a big influence on me, even though my pictures don't look like his. His approach to his working approach is one that I take on. But this work, I look at it a lot. In fact, I mean, I even have the new Topographics book, which is a much better printing of the catalog with a lot more pictures. And Steidl did a beautiful job on that, and so you really get the richness of the pictures. But I think that at some point, I'm going to address the whole matter of landscape for myself. It's something I'm curious about, and it keeps leaking out of the pictures. I'm going through a very large edit of pictures from 2021 and 2022, and what's falling out of that are some pictures that are very much in line with this conversation, this whole idea. So we'll see. You can't argue sometimes with the stuff that you're making.
You know, we haven't referenced two major figures in that show, which are Joe Deal and Frank Golke. I know both those guys. I got to be pretty close with Joe Deal because he wrote a introduction for a book I did in the early 2000s before he died. But those guys, and I don't know, maybe Wessel, I don't know Wessel's work as well, but they moved, I think they moved from Lewis Baltz into more lyrical kinds of pictures and allowed some emotionality and perhaps even some beauty in their work. And Lewis Baltz did not. You know, he's definitely objectifying and trying to be cool and distant from these pictures, and unemotional, of course.
So you said something. I don't disagree with anything, but you said beauty. I mean, as I look at these, there's I mean, they're certainly minimalist and they're clean and they're austere, but right, I think they're beautiful.
They are, and maybe the past 40 years or so allow you as a relative newcomer into photography to be able to see that, as opposed to when these came out.
Sure.
You know, they were sort of a slap in the face, weren't they?
Well, that's a good point.
Right.
That's good. I hadn't thought about that.
Well, that's interesting you would say that, a slap in the face. I think that this curator, just to talk about the whole body of new topographics as a category, he looked for places where these photographers intersected. So Joe Deal had pictures, terrific pictures of backyards.
Yes.
From altitude.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Really terrific pictures. And so Robert Adams had pictures of backyards. And so Lewis Baltz had pictures of backyards and so on. So this what do they call that with circles, and when as circles intersect, there's a section in between. He looked for those things and he linked it all up and he said, okay, this is what photographers are doing. This is the man-altered landscape, and this is an example of that. And then he's got Nick Nixon in there, who's got pictures of Boston landscapes.
Yeah,
so
right.
But,
early Nick Nixon, yeah, and Stephen Shore.
Right, and Stephen Shore, who I think showed color work. And
I think that's right.
It was color work.
You know better than I do, but I can't imagine he was showing black and white work. And he was working in color.
He has black and white work that is worth looking at, but the color work was what put him on the map.
Absolutely,
but,
8x10.
But back to this, I mean, I always thought of Lewis Baltz as just not as a photographer who just didn't want to have anything to do with photographers. I mean, he really
he just didn't like photographers.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I mean, what's he missing?
Can you
what
blame
am I
it?
missing? Right.
Yeah.
So, but you listen to him talk, and there are recordings of him talking. I mean, he sounds like an aristocrat, and
that fits.
Does it fit? Yeah.
Yep.
So,
right.
But the later work in color was a disappointment to me. I mean, I guess I was waiting for him. Okay.
No.
Yeah, I mean, there's something
it's done. In some ways, he's done it earlier.
Right. I think he's trying to squeeze, have color carry him to the next thing. But I mean, I've seen this particular picture here before, and I think it's probably the strongest of the color pictures. But you notice that it's not a flat picture. It's not one of those, walls that he's trying to photograph.
So is there, this is probably a silly question to ask, but is there anything that you can learn about the person from the photography, from the artwork? So Like, is there anything about him as a human being that we can make assumptions of from this, or does that matter?
I don't know whether it matters or not, but Neal and I had an exchange earlier today because we were thinking about this, and we were thinking about this. And we were talking about the mirrors and windows show that Sarkowski did
1978.
in 78, right? So I asked Neal. I said, so in looking at Lewis Baltz's work, was he a mirror or a window?
Maybe
No,
could you, so before you go into that, explain, because explain the difference between a mirror and a window, because it's the way a photographer looks, right?
In simple terms, a photographer is either recording, he's always recording, or she is always recording the world outside them. But is it simply that, or which is a window into the world, or is it a reflection of an internal world?
Right.
Something
or of the
like
photographer.
So,
right. Yeah.
So you're asking then, is
Sarkowski
Lewis
might
Baltz,
think that my description is simple-minded.
we're going to go with it though. So is Lewis Baltz a mirror or a window, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It didn't take me long to answer, did it?
No.
And what was your answer?
Window. Right.
It's totally a window, because you don't know what his inner world is.
No, he doesn't want you to know.
Right.
It's distant, and that gets me into a little bit of what's often thought of as being conceptual work. In some ways, this is conceptual, and I think one of the ways that affected me that way was that. Walk away from this show that I didn't see, but I saw the book, and I've got to think about this. I've got to wrestle with it, what it's posing. Look at an Ansel Adams landscape. You don't have to wrestle with much at all. And so there's a change in that definition of photography. And like I said, it's moving forward, and he's definitely part of it.
Well, you definitely have to wrestle with these.
Yes.
These are images and a body of work that you have to spend time with and think about and try to
Imagine
understand.
yourself.
And still relevant today, I think, in many ways.
Imagine your 22-year-old self seeing this in 1970, whatever, five.
Yeah.
And, it's like, what the hell is going on here?
Exactly. Right. This is photography. Right. Right.
It was just undecipherable. It was in many ways like Walker Evans's work the first time I saw it. I couldn't figure it out.
In the house of George Eastman, who invented, made Kodak, right? It was just kind of a mind-boggling concept that somebody was validating this work, right?
It was pretty
rocked
cool.
my world.
Well, before we got underway, we were talking a little bit about how the massive influence. I mean, I can't think of another show, group show that has been done that has had so much of a long-term influence on generations of photographers thereafter. I mean, there may have been bigger shows like Family of Man that may have been sort of broader culturally known than this.
Right.
But what has had more influence than this particular show and these photographers doing this work?
Perhaps only one, and I would say Dean Arbus.
I was going to go there too. Yeah.
Okay.
The show,
because that
1973,
1974.
Right.
I mean, people were standing in line
around
outside
the
Museum of Modern Art to get in there to see that show. People were standing 6 deep, looking at those pictures.
Right.
And people had never seen pictures like that before.
No.
So her influence was huge. And so I think what happened is you had that, and then you had the new topographics, and then, you know, the whole Sarkowski package. I mean, he was really something else.
You know, maybe some of the Cindy Sherman work had that kind of effect.
Yeah. She was later.
She was,
but,
yeah.
You know, that she certainly is a player.
The movie stills were big, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
but
I guess
you know, we're getting into, you know, conceptual art.
right.
So, gentlemen, I want to wrap it up. And we're getting toward the end of our time, but
we're just getting warmed up here.
I know. What have we not talked about Lewis Baltz's work that we should make sure that the YouTube audience that's watching this is aware of?
So I don't know if this answers or relates to that question, Jeff, but Michael and I will talk sometimes about how nobody knows anything, and particularly younger people. So in my career as a teacher, one of my jobs was to bring this to class, this work, Arbus work, you know, important work, and share it with students, and usually in slide form, but sometimes with books, to try to bring them into some very often more recent history, to try to help them understand the medium, and their again, also to give permission to tacitly to give permission to go their own separate way creatively, and that so many people have done so many incredible things. So nowadays, I think Michael would agree, we get a sense that people don't know the history of the medium. And here we are talking about a really crucial phase in the development of artistic photography, in this case in the 20th century. And hopefully this program will do that. We'll bring this work into awareness with particularly younger people that don't know it. And all those people that see that can pursue this. They can look at the work of those other photographers in that show as a foundation. And I'm kind of proud that we're able to do that. And it's one of the reasons that Michael and I chose Lewis Baltz, was that we could bring his work into a wider view, and particularly a younger creative person's view.
Well, I certainly appreciate that. As an older person, I'm still learning these things, and I think it's a great conversation to have, and I appreciate you bringing that perspective. Michael, I'm going to give you the last word for what, if anything, you feel is important to and noteworthy about this conversation. And Mr. Baltz,
I think you know, Neal brings up a really interesting point. I think a lot of people who watch this particular program are interested in making pictures. They're photographers who are interested in their own photography.
yes.
And I think that, you know, we're all learning, and photography is such a generous medium that it provides constant feedback. But it's difficult to know how to inform your work, because I think that you need to be working, and you need to be looking at really important work, great work. You know, your work will move in that direction, and that's what Neal was talking about permission. You know, that you know, you saw another way, and I think that this photographer, Lewis Baltz, and the others that we've talked about, all provided that permission, and you know, they set the bar. So, you know, this is not Flickr. This is
No, it's a high bar.
This is exactly. So it's great that you do this, Jeff, that you bring a certain curatorial to the programming. It's great.
Well, thank you.
I'm hardly a curator. I mean, I can talk very casually about Lewis Baltz. I admire the work enormously.
Well, thank you for saying that. It's this is my education, and I think that I think it's important for people to also see other work. One of the things that I found really interesting about both of your conversations is to put it into context of history. And I'll reference, so my son, who's 20 years old, loves music nowadays, but he doesn't understand the history of music and where it came from. So he doesn't understand the seismic shift of the Beatles in the popular music realm, and the Rolling Stones, and sort of the things that happened, because to him it all sounds old. He's heard it before, and to have this conversation about where there was a seismic shift in photography in the art world, and to understand that was, I think, really helpful for me to understand. But it also gives me the ability to look at this in the context of my work, and really your input and your thoughts are fantastic to hear, and I really appreciate the time that you've given to this. So thank you both very much.
My pleasure.
So folks, I'm gonna link out to a couple
fun.
of videos that you'll be able to see that we've talked about during this event. And I thank you all for joining us here on the Crit House Masters, and we hope to have more of these conversations to come in the near future. Thank you all
Good to be
for
with you.
watching the Crit House. Thanks, Neil.
Yep.
Thanks, Michael.